As we build up to the brand new 2022 era, the talk of Abu Dhabi, the FIA and Michael Masi is still very much at the forefront of F1. I've wanted to have an open, honest and in-depth discussion about the state of stewarding in F1 for a while now, and so this will be a very special video. This will very much be a podcast style video, and I was lucky enough to be joined by Katy Fairman from WTF1 as we discussed in depth about how we've got to such a difficult situation with the current state of the FIA, and more importantly, what needs to change going forward for the good of Formula One. I hope you enjoy the video. So Katy, thank you so much for coming on the channel. Today's going to be a very interesting video. I mean, are you kind of sick to death at this point about talking about the FIA and the stewarding? Are you excited for this one, or are you just like, oh no, not again?
Well, when I do my other podcast with WTF1, there's become a segment of the podcast now, which is Katy's FIA rant, which I thought was just going to be a few conversations here and there, but it ended up happening almost every single race weekend. And then Abu Dhabi happened, which I know we're going to talk about in great detail in this video. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an important conversation to have. Obviously, after Abu Dhabi, more people are having that conversation, whereas sometimes it felt like just little old me having a little moan about the FIA and how things were handled. But I think it is important for fans also to use their voice and say that they're not happy with how things went.
Yeah, and I mean, we're going to just kind of start what I'm going to call kind of the beginning. And in terms of those segments of Katy ranting about the FIA, imagine that, but this is the whole video basically, because I think both of us have been vocal and have quite a lot to say. But I want to begin actually in kind of where I think the start of this, which is the beginning of 2019. Obviously, the shock passing of Charlie Whiting, I think was the race director for over 20 years. So it was, and again, it was right before Australia, before he obviously passed away. So it was a massive shock to Formula One. But yeah, Michael Masi came in as the race director, actually, I think immediately at that point, but obviously we didn't really quite know about him. At what point do you think, even in 2019, even in those early days, do you think there was any kind of big flashpoint straight away?
Definitely. I mean, obviously, Charlie Whiting was such an influential and well-respected guy in motorsport and F1. He'd had a career of over 50 years in motorsport. You know, he started in F1 as a mechanic at Hesketh, then moved up to Brabham and got promoted to chief engineer when Nelson Piquet won his first championship. So he's somebody that has been involved in an integral part of that sport for such a long time. He knows it inside out. Then, like you say, joined the FIA after the 1987 season. So being part of that management structure and getting an insight into everything meant that he had so much knowledge and, you know, incredibly talented in making these kind of decisions and knowing what was best for people. But yeah, Michael Masi, I learned this when I was looking up information for this video. He had been with the FIA for 10 races when he was promoted to race director, which, I mean, poor guy, like, yes, he's made some questionable decisions in his time, but being promoted into such a senior role after just 10 races must have been a huge challenge, and fair play to him for taking it on. There could have been people around him that maybe were better suited for that position, but it takes guts to fill such big shoes. But maybe in hindsight, 10 races was not enough time to have had that experience to put him in that role.
Yeah, it's a weird one. I don't think we really even thought about it at the time in terms of what Charlie Whiting passing away, what would that mean? Because I think, again, it's almost retrospectively we think about it now in terms of how big the job is. I mean, even in 2019, I thought, racing stewards and racing directors, like, maybe doesn't have such a big of an effect, but it's certainly something that me as a fan, I've definitely come to learn, like, that is a very high pressure job, and it's almost like a team principle. Like, you need to get it right. It can't just be anyone. And to control the F1 circus is obviously not easy, but we'll get to Michael Masi a little bit later on. But again, I think even in 2019, obviously, I think he got the job. I don't know if he got it straight away in terms of the entire season, because I think it was in Australia. I think he was the racing director for V8 Supercars, so he had a bit of experience there. And I think then he got the full-time role kind of off the back of, Australia and how the season started. But even early on, I think in 2019, I still remember flashpoints and little decisions and just things not really kind of making sense to me. And even things that I must be honest, I had not seen before. So the likes of, even Canada 2019 with Seb and Lewis, that was a very controversial one. Obviously, we had, again, Leclerc and Verstappen, the first kind of really big flashpoint in Austria that year. But the thing that really stood out to me was Monza 2019. And actually, retrospectively looking back, the one thing I do remember about that, and me and Tomo especially have had so many discussions about Monza 2019 and Leclerc and Hamilton, is that it really felt at the time, and I didn't realize it almost until I thought about Abu Dhabi as well, that there was some very harsh racing by Leclerc. I think obviously he was defending for his life. It was his first season for Ferrari. The whole Monza aspect, there was so much emotion and kind of narrative into that. And some of the things, his racing was right on the edge and maybe even over. And I remember the decisions at the time. I mean, he got a black and white flag. He was obviously, pushing kind of Lewis. Did he leave Lewis enough space? He also went a little bit wide at the first hairpin. And I remember it got to the point where, is he going to get a penalty? Is this going to be investigated? And he was given a black and white flag. And the one thing that, and again, me and Tom have talked about this, we feel like he almost got away a little bit because of the narrative. And I feel like that's the first time that anything like that I've ever seen creep in terms of it's Leclerc, it's Ferrari, it's Monza. Yes, it was maybe right on the edge, maybe even over, but, maybe just let him have it. I mean, how did you even think about that back then? Did you think that it was controversial, or did you understand that they didn't really even investigate it and gave him a black and white flag that I don't think we've really seen before or since, or certainly not a lot?
No, I remember obviously watching it live and thinking that's going to be quite like a spicy take on the internet. People are going to be definitely split. But yeah, one of the things that I took away from that is that certain drivers were saying that they were going to change their racing style. If things like that went, unpunished essentially, then it begged the question of, well, we've been racing, this way for so long, and now another way is being allowed to race, and that's a lot harsher and a lot more, I guess, brutal in the way that they were racing, and nothing seemed to happen there. But what I found interesting then revisiting Monza in 2021, still the start of a brand new year. I'm going to keep doing this mistake probably up until March. But
I've done it too. Oh my, it's embarrassing. Don't worry. We've all done it.
Yeah, in 2021, obviously, we had a little bit of a tussle between Ocon and Vettel, and Ocon was penalised for this incident with Vettel, and it begged the question of like, well, how come there was no kind of penalty from 2019? And Masi said that after the Monza 2019 incident, he discussed the incident with all the drivers, and it was decided that in hindsight, a 5-second penalty probably would have been better for that situation. So, I mean, it is good that he was able to have those discussions with the drivers. Obviously, we see all the driver briefings, or we had them on YouTube when Charlie Whiting was in charge, which I would love it nothing more than for that to come back onto the F1 YouTube channel, because my goodness, the memes and the reactions that came out of those meetings, as well as obviously being hugely fascinating, were great. But yeah, it's one of those things which I guess was the start of the kind of inconsistencies that we've come to see. But yeah, that was certainly a controversial incident in Monza.
And actually, off the back of that, the reason why they don't do the driver briefings anymore, I've heard, is because the drivers actually push back against it. The teams and drivers saw, the attention that those drivers... I mean, we love it as content. I mean, those memes, that Sergio Perez just stare.
Oh my goodness, so good.
It's still relevant today. I still see that now. But the drivers and teams actually pushed against it because they thought, that's almost our private time with the race director where we can share our thoughts. So they kind of actually pushed against that. So I find it quite interesting on that front. But yeah, 2019 was just... that was the first little sign. There were just a few things throughout the season, a few controversial moments where even I thought, I've never really seen this before in Formula One. And I've been watching since 2012, so I haven't even been watching for that long. But even then, I never really saw those things. And a lot of fans have said this, and I kind of want to get your opinion as well, is that there's almost like, with rose-tinted spectacles looking back, what did we have this under Charlie Whiting? Was it so much better? Because again, with all of the criticism for Michael Masi and the FIA, there are a lot of people that said that we never had this in the Charlie Whiting era. Do you kind of agree with that, or do you think it's almost kind of a narrative that people have convinced themselves that it was so much better?
I kind of disagree with it to a point, because, I mean, even looking back at the 2016 Mexico Grand Prix, Sebastian Vettel with that famous piece of team radio telling Charlie Whiting to F off on team radio. And it took, the Ferrari bosses at Ferrari to come onto the team radio and be like, Sebastian, calm down. Like, you can just get your head down and race, and we can talk about this afterwards. But I remember at the time, like, having Vettel tell the race director to F off, like, that was just... you know, unheard of to hear a driver have such a strong opinion and, you know, be so rude. Obviously, we all know with team radios, in the heat of the moment, drivers say things which they probably might later come to regret, or, you know, we're never going to understand what it's like to be in that race seat, racing hard, and the pressure that comes with that. You know, people say things on team radio all the time. But yeah, that was like a big moment. And obviously with Charlie, there were going to be incidents which were maybe slightly controversial, or, you know, bite back on certain things. Even, you know, going back to the safety kind of things with the briefings that they have on YouTube. You know, there was one discussion they had with Hamilton where they were saying Hamilton's taking his belts off and when the race is finished and waving to the crowd, and Charlie was like, well, that's not allowed. Lewis, you're not doing that, are you? And he was kind of like, you know, a bit like naughty boy being told off by the headmaster. And so there were things that were slipping through the net because, you know, Hamilton was taking his belts off, not loosening them up as Charlie Whiting said that he could do. He was actually fully taking the belts off. But yeah, in terms of actual on-track controversies and, you know, subsequent penalties, I can't think off the top of my head of too many that happened recently in Formula One under Charlie Whiting's control. So
yeah, and it's not as if we didn't have controversial and heated title battles during the Charlie Whiting era. I mean, even in the hybrid era, you had the likes, obviously, 2014, the incidents with Lewis and Nico, 2016 as well. So even in just the last kind of Mercedes dominance era before we even got to 2017, I remember there was a big, obviously, talking point. I think it was USA 2017, obviously Verstappen getting on the podium but cutting the corner. I remember people just going crazy about that, but I mean, when you actually look at it, he did cut the corner. So it's a strange way to kind of tell to fans, yes, Verstappen is on the podium and he kind of cut the corner. So should this be allowed? So even then, I think the FIA kind of, even against, I'm sure, massive pressure, they kind of handled it quite well, even in that scenario. But so then we get to obviously the second year of Michael Masi's reign in 2020. And again, even then, more little cracks, just more little moments where, for me personally, I think the big one that stood out to me was in Turkey, where I think it was, obviously we remember that was a crazy race in terms of the track conditions, the weather as well. I think it was so cold that even though it wasn't raining, the track just wasn't drying out. It was a really strange situation. And obviously the track surface as well, coming back to Istanbul after so many years. And there was just one little thing. I remember that, I think it was Nicholas Latifi that had a crash. And the safety car obviously came out. And even by the time the safety car was coming in and we got that message, there was still a truck on the track. And as they were going for their first laps out, you know, once the safety car had gone, there was still I remember there was still a truck on the track. And even Kimi came on the radio, you know, kind of questioning why we're still racing. So again, little things like that. Do you remember anything from 2020 that again made you kind of think, you know, what's going on here? This is also not quite right.
Yeah, well, like you say, Turkey is definitely one that stands out. I think I seem to remember it being around maybe in qualifying when that happened, because I just joined WTF1 and I think the guys were doing a watch along or something like that, and the session had been perhaps red flagged, and then they were brought on, and yeah, like you say, the truck was still on the track. And obviously lots of us fans have really awful memories of incidents involving trucks on the track, which, you know, obviously none of us ever want to see something like that happen again. So taking that very seriously, it was a bit of a concern to see cars going round on a track that was essentially an ice rink, with recovery vehicles still, you know, within, I guess, or well, on the track, on the sidelines there. So yeah, that was very concerning. But one that also stands out for me was Imola that year, when the FIA let cars unlap themselves, and there were still marshals on the track recovering debris from when Russell had his incident behind the safety car. And you know, people's lives, we have seen it in the past in F1 where there have been incidents on the track involving marshals and cars. So any kind of opportunity for something like that to happen again is obviously hugely shocking and not what we want to happen. So that angered me a lot that was allowed to happen. I don't know if it was a miscommunication or what it was, but yeah, that's something that really kind of got my attention, and I was like, well, that's really not okay.
Yeah, I think at this point, even towards the end of 2020, there was already questions, and I think 2021, which we're going to get onto now, I think it just magnified everything. Everything just got turned up to 11 in terms of the scrutiny,
100%.
the team principal radios. I mean, we talked about there was already a few cracks and everything, and I don't want to say that, the FIA and Michael Masi were set up, to fail in 2021 because of the massive scrutiny, cameras always on them, but I don't think it got any worse when we did get into this title battle. And even from the first race, even in Bahrain, we had, if you remember all the way back to the beginning of that crazy season, even the first race, we had the whole Lewis obviously cutting or going wide. I think it was at turn 4 or something for lap after lap. And the moment Red Bull started doing it, that's when the FIA got on them and said, you can't do this anymore. And I remember that's the first time I think we saw a bit of team radio between the FIA and the teams in terms of, well, why has Lewis been able to do it all race and we can't? So already there was, even in the first race, there was already controversy. I mean, how did you see that coming into 2021, now that we did have this title battle and maybe even more scrutiny on the FIA to get things right?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt in the fact that this was going to be a huge challenge for Michael Masi and the FIA. Like you say, as soon as we got to Bahrain, even we had like little suggestions of this could be a really good season in pre-season testing when Mercedes were looking not quite as strong as we're used to seeing them, and Red Bull and that Honda power unit looking really strong. But yeah, that's one thing that it's in my ideal little world, Aldas, I would love it if the FIA and the race director team, they were like Big Brother. They had cameras on absolutely everything. And whether you're Lewis Hamilton or you're Max Verstappen and you've broken a rule, and obviously that's going to get more attention with the TV coverage and you're going to see it. But like fans now with F1 TV, they're able to revisit onboards from drivers, a few hours after the race. And you could see lap after lap that the front two were being penalised for, going over the track limits. But we were seeing cars, in the middle of the pack that were doing it lap after lap. Some of them even doing overtakes going off the track, and it never seemed to be picked up. And that's one thing that I would love for the future of F1 is, get more resource in there. And I think that even if you're battling for 12th position, you should be facing the same penalties for doing exactly the same, whether you're in first and second or, 11th and 12th. And that's one thing that I feel sometimes gets missed, like you say, on Reddit or wherever it might be, on F1 Twitter. These onboards are getting shared now more and more because more and more fans are getting F1 TV and getting into it and, wanting to watch back their favourite driver and how they got on throughout the race because they haven't been given much TV time. And yet noticing these things, which for me is like a slam dunk penalty. Prime example being Mick Schumacher towards the end of the year, when he went off the track within I think it was in Qatar, when Alonso was trying to make that podium, and Mick Schumacher had gone off the track and rejoined the track in what I would say is an unsafe manner and should have been penalised. Nothing, no investigation, regardless if that was Alonso who was about to make it onto the podium or Mick Schumacher did that to Nicholas Latifi or, someone, Kimi Raikkonen at the back of the pack, that should have been a penalty. But because I guess it's further down the grid and they've got so much other stuff going on, it's not investigated. And I don't think that is fair. But yeah, in terms of Bahrain, it was evident that things might get a little bit scatty going forward because, when Max was given the penalty, he said, I'd rather just keep going and try and get a 5-second gap rather than let it back. But that's just Max Verstappen, isn't it? He would rather just keep racing hard rather than let Hamilton through and take these penalties and stuff. So yes, like I said, though, it's a difficult job for Michael Masi. But yeah, like you said, we started to see the pressure really starting to bubble away.
I think that when you said about fairness, about the front of the field to the back of the field to someone in the middle, that's definitely something that we're going to get onto when we talk about Abu Dhabi. But I also felt like there was a bit of a shift in terms of, and you talked about it earlier, drivers changing their driving styles to the rule book. Because, I mean, Max Verstappen has been at the centre of kind of this conversation all season long. I mean, just outside of the title battle. And I think Imola was another one of those. That was a very interesting beginning to the race. Well, obviously him and Lewis, they made contact. There's no doubt about it. Obviously, Max sent it down the inside. And we know Max is going to do that because he's got this kind of, he's never going to hold back. He's got his driving style. And I mean, we all saw some interviews where some journalists asked him, are you going to change your driving style back in 2018 when he had his little rough run of a few kind of incidents? And he said, no. I mean, he just simply flat out said, no, I am Max Verstappen. I drive at 110% all the time. And we kind of saw our two title protagonists kind of for the second time come together in turn. I think it was turn 2 technically in Imola, which was the kind of proper first turn. Max kind of pushing Lewis a little bit off. And do you think, what impact do you think that had? Because I honestly feel at that point, Max kind of really started to realize, I know that I can push the boundaries here. I can see what the FIA, I can see that the fans love that this is hard racing. The FIA clearly are allowing me to get away with stuff like this. So, I mean, I'm just gonna use it to the full extent. How did you see that? Do you think kind of as the season progressed, especially Max Verstappen saw the rule book and just started to play along with it, or do you think it was maybe a bit over the edge, but the stewards maybe didn't do anything about it?
I think it's a mix of two things. I mean, firstly, Max, like, we've known he's an aggressive driver since he joined Formula One. Like you say, when he was starting out, there were a few little incidents and blips that we saw where he was being very aggressive. But I like that. I like that change of driving style. It kind of reminds me a bit of like in MotoGP when Marc Marquez joined. His riding style was very different to what some other people had seen. And, look where it's got him now. Like, he's obviously hugely successful and multiple champion over in MotoGP. So I don't think it's an issue with Max having to change his driving style, because throughout F1 history, there are always going to be drivers, and even like look at Schumi, for example. He's hailed as the GOAT in Formula One, and he is somebody who was not shy of a controversy or two, and that's why so many people liked him for that, because he wasn't afraid to go for a gap or have a bit of roughy-tufty with another driver. And for Hamilton, although he is also exceptional at wheel-to-wheel battle, I mean, crikey, like the start of Silverstone up until obviously Cops, that for me is some of the best racing I have ever seen in Formula One. And every time I think about it, I kind of just blank out Cops now. I'm like, no, that didn't happen. But like that first few seconds was just absolutely incredible, like bliss, like just amazing. And so Hamilton can go wheel to wheel, but for so long, he's been used to rocking up to a racetrack, popping it on pole, and then sometimes, more often than not, just sort of going from a lights to flag victory with not really much in the way of competition. Obviously, Bottas was a great wingman, but it was very rare for him to sort of ever have any kind of wheel-to-wheel battle with Bottas. We've seen it a few times, but
I think 2019 Silverstone probably is the biggest. Again, kind of the similar complex where him and Max had their battle this year.
Yeah.
2019 Silverstone is the only time I really remember Bottas really taking it to Hamilton and possibly coming out on top in wheel-to-wheel combat in those kind of first few laps.
Yeah, 100%. So for Lewis, I'm not saying that, because he's been so good at what he does and, been having to just literally go from pole to win it, that he's lost his touch or anything like that. But he's come into this season and Max is there alongside him, and Max hasn't changed it. I wouldn't say Max has got more aggressive or anything like that, knowing that, Michael Masi is in charge. I would argue that Max is the same driver as he was when Charlie Whiting was there. He's, it's part of his DNA. It's how he's learnt to race, and obviously it's worked out well for him looking back at his 2021 season, with so many victories and podiums and such. But yeah, I think it was just a case of Verstappen finally having that platform, knowing he could win a championship very early on in the season. It's not like he got halfway through the season and was like, I could actually do this. Like, he rocked up in Bahrain, in Imola, like, if I do things right, I could win this championship. And he just delivered. So I don't think there's anything to sort of say that Max was... He knew the loopholes and that the FIA were being a bit more relaxed. I think he just literally was like, I'm just going to race how I would normally race and hope for the best. So...
And I think that's why people like love to watch him race. I mean, he is such an amazing driver, and the way he goes about racing, and certainly this year, it's almost binary. You know what you're going to get with Max. There's not going to be much risk management. We see the contrasting styles, especially early on. I think later on, Lewis obviously behind in the points, he realized that he did have to stand up. And I think Silverstone was one of those examples, but certainly very early on, he was always pushing. He was always going for the move. Lewis was almost thinking, he was backing out on multiple occasions because he's always thinking of that long game. But so that's what made it so interesting. There's such different characters, but also very different races as well. And I feel like that was one of the big reasons why 2021 was undoubtedly a classic season. But what's actually something else from Imola that I think has been talked about in so many different other tracks, but track limits in terms of when do we cross the white line, when do we not cross the white line, it changing from race to race, from track to track, from year to year. What are your thoughts about all of that? Because I remember that coming up a little bit and it's still not clear now. I mean, even towards the end of the season, we were still going to tracks and wondering, is it the white line? Is it not? And even changing from session to session. I remember the FIA making notes, obviously, from practice to qualifying to the race. And actually, I think the question I want to ask is, why is it not just the white line? I mean, shouldn't it just be that if you create a good enough car, it should stick to the limits of the track and just the white line defines the racetrack? Or why do you think we're still in this kind of weird kind of limbo period where it changes from race to race?
Yeah, I mean, it just comes back to that word inconsistency, which I think is probably how F1 fans would describe the whole of FIA's management of things in 2021. I think in certain situations, they handled it bang on, like it was the right call to be made. But on other things, like track limits or other, similar incidents where things evaded penalties, it didn't make much sense. But yeah, with track limits, that's one thing that really begun to grate on me is how can you go to a racetrack and you've done your track walks and you've got so much data. I mean, fair enough, like when we visited Portimao, for example, in 2020, that's a completely unfamiliar circuit and we didn't have much in terms of single seaters that were kind of comparable to Formula One that had been there. It was mainly motorbikes or maybe some GT racing or something. So I can see why once you've had practice, you're like, okay, we haven't said, for example, turn 3 or whatever, there's going to be issues there. But having seen the cars on track, we can see that we need to just bolt that down now and say that it's not allowed. But yeah, when we're going to tracks where we've been racing at for a decade and you suddenly get a change of track limits on a Saturday night for the race on Sunday. I can't remember exactly who it was, but we've definitely heard team radio in 2021 where somebody's come on to their driver and said, you need to be careful of, I don't know, turn 16 because you've got 2 track limits violations already. And they've come back and said, wait, I thought it was fine. And they're like, oh no, they changed it last night. That shouldn't be happening. It should be get there on the Thursday. The race director delivers his notes that he publishes to everyone and said, right, A, B, C, and D. If you break the track limits at those turns, then you're going to get a penalty. It shouldn't be A and then get an updated version and then B and then an updated. It shouldn't be working that way. And as a result, track limits is always going to be a controversial subject. Gotta take my hat off to Fernando Alonso for his move in Sochi, because that was the biggest 2 fingers up to the FIA that I can remember in quite a long time. Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. That's the thing. Since he's come back, maybe it's having an outside view of things, because obviously when he left F1 back in 2018, yeah. Yeah. That was still under the reign of Charlie Whiting. So he's come back now with Michael Masi in charge. And yeah, he's obviously quite unhappy with how some things have been handled. His furious rant that he had after Austria when Daniel Ricciardo broke track limits. And that's still one of my favourite radio clips from the whole year, is him being like, Ricciardo, he broke track limits and, he got to give the places back and stuff. He's so animated on team radio. I love it.
That was an impeccable Alonso impression. I loved it.
Thank you very much. I really hope I haven't offended anyone with that, but I've listened back to that bit of team radio enough times that, yeah, I love the way that he rolls his R's when he says Ricciardo. It's really cool. But yeah, and nothing was done about it. So that was kind of Alonso being like, right, okay, well, I'll deal with this myself then. So yeah, track limits is something I really hope that we kind of buckle down and get some proper clarification on that in 2022. That's one of the things I'd like to see going forward, because yeah, it was a case of like on WTF1 I was writing an article or making a graphic. It seemed like every weekend of being like, track limits have changed here, or this has happened, or one driver has complained about track limits doing this. So yeah, it's not what F1 needs and the fan needs as well. They need just it to be nice and simple in black and white. If you cross this line, then you're going to get in trouble.
I mean, we saw that with Lando Norris, I think, in Imola. He was on a stunning qualifying lap, but he just went over the line, and ultimately, as good as that lap still was, and he wouldn't have gained that much time, you know, a couple of thousands maybe, but that's racing, you know, that it's black or white, and the best drivers have to keep it within the limits. But I think the two things that you said that I really picked up on is the Fernando Alonso thing is very interesting, because like you said, when he left, we were still under the Charlie Whiting regime, and I do think that when he came back, a little bit of that frustration that we know Fernando is always very animated on team radio, drivers going off, taking really strange lines, and then him even, what he did at Sochi, I think it was kind of almost testing and wondering what is going on here. What is this new stewarding regime? Why is this allowed? Is this now allowed? Why am I not doing it? So I think that's why Fernando is a really interesting comparison, because he's literally come in kind of the peak of the controversy in 2021. So that's definitely that's definitely something that I picked up on. And on the track limits thing, I mean, drivers and teams are always going to be selfish. They're going to push the limits every single time. They're going to want to take the widest line that gives them the best possible speed out of a corner or into a corner. But it's the job of the stewards, it's the job of the FIA to kind of rein them back in. Because we know if it was the drivers, they'd just straight line every single corner, because that would be the quickest line through there. So again, it kind of comes back to the whole, who's in charge here? Is it the drivers and the teams influencing the FIA, or is it, you know, Michael Masi and the FIA probably having their hold on the sport? So yeah, that was also, again, track limits. It's something that we've been talking about for years, and it does need to be seriously kind of picked up on. Now, then we get to the Belgian Grand Prix. Now, there are other incidents before then, but I think that's definitely a big talking point in terms of the way I felt about it. First of all, I actually talked to someone only a few days ago that actually went to the Belgian Grand Prix. I felt so sorry for them.
Wow.
But yeah, they weren't exactly happy. Apparently they got some they got some discount tickets on F1 TV, so, or something like that. So I felt so sorry. Apparently that's what you get when you don't watch a Grand Prix. But the biggest thing to me is that when we did see that clearly there was not going to be a race, I think that whole send them out for, what was it, 1, 2 or 3 laps, I think that was purely a box ticking exercise. Let them go out for the minimum amount that we need in the contract to say that it is a Grand Prix. And I think that's literally what we saw. So, I mean, that was so controversial at the time. I mean, how did you feel about the whole race? I say it in inverted commas.
Mate, it was so disappointing. Like, I think that's where the Katy rants on the podcast kind of had its peak, apart from Abu Dhabi, was it was just so massively disappointing. I am fully aware F1, you know, is an outdoor sporting event. If it snows, it's going to affect it. If there's a hurricane, then it's going to affect it. If there's rain, it's going to affect it. And I'm amazed that we hadn't actually reached a point yet in its, 71-year history where a race had been so hugely affected by rain that it was not safe for them to go out and race. And obviously there are things in the rule book, in the sporting regulations, that state if in the unusual circumstance that this has happened, these are the rules that should be applied. But it wasn't. And, although it's difficult to, I completely see where Michael Masi was coming from in terms of wanting to not only, like you say, make it an official race. Obviously, they've got circuit organisers that have paid a lot for F1 to be there. They've got fans, which, should really be the top priority here. And, all the millions of people around the world that are watching it on TV. I mean, for us Europeans, it was annoying having a race, rained off for 3 hours and sat twiddling our thumbs, watching all these drivers, messing around, dancing with each other or playing football in the garages. But for poor people in, maybe Asia or Australia or some of the early birds in America, they might be tuning in to watch that at like 4 a.m. and there's no racing happening. So it needed to sort of be, if it was going to be rained off, it needed to be said early on, like, we can see there's not going to be much chance for an improvement. The best window we've got might last 15 minutes. And to me, that's evident that's not going to be a race. That's going to be some parade laps, because unfortunately, there's not going to be some sort of miracle from God where the track dries up like that and we can go racing and it'll all be hunky-dory. Like, there was always going to be, it's always going to be a wet race. So, yeah, the one thing that stood with me with that is Karun Chandhok, when he was working with Sky Sports, he was in the pit lane trying to get an update from the teams.
I remember that.
And he said that he'd spoken to like 7 teams and got 7 different answers as to what on earth was going on. And that should never be the case. Like, there needs to be clearer instructions to say, okay, if we don't have what we deem a suitable, space for racing, in inverted commas, within the next 2 hours, then this race is off. But it was just a complete guessing game. And all the rules sort of went out the window. And by the time we did eventually get racing, if you can call it that, like you say, it was just a parade behind the safety car. And half points were awarded and they could call it an official Grand Prix and things like that. But yeah, that was just a big mess. And although, in all of these situations, I do feel some sort of sympathy towards Michael Masi and the rest of the stewards and the rest of the FIA, as much as I love to, have a rant about it and say what I would do better. The reality is it's an incredibly difficult job to be the person at the top making those calls and trying to make sure everybody's informed with what's going on when you probably don't really know what's going on yourself. But yeah, much more clarity was needed in that situation. And it left a very bitter taste in a lot of F1 fans' mouths. And that was only the sort of tip of the iceberg as we came back from the summer break, which says a lot.
Yeah, and I think even actually outside of the safety car parade, there was still a few things, even some of the red flags in qualifying. Obviously, perhaps there should have been a red flag that was thrown out in quali before Lando had his crash as well. I don't think the track was really suitable at the time. And then again, that confusion that you talked about, because even after we finished the race, I think people were actually confused within the rules if we actually had done enough laps under I think it was green flag racing for it to even, I think it was 3 or 2 was the minimum. So when you have the teams that are confused, when you have the teams that are confused, when you have different answers from people in terms of how many laps have we done, how many laps are we doing, and just things along that nature, I mean, that the fans being confused is one thing, but the teams and the drivers have to know what's going on, because the FIA, it all comes down to safety, especially in those conditions. So the entire weekend of Spa, I think, from the very beginning was just it was a mess. The only good thing about it was George Russell and that incredible lap to P2. I'm not gonna lie. I'm happy he got on the podium anyway. I know it wasn't a race, but as a George Russell fan, that was still brilliant to see.
It was a very wholesome moment. But even like with Perez, obviously binning it on the way to the grid, and it states in the rules and regulations that if you have assistance from a recovery vehicle, then you shouldn't really be allowed to start the race. And they let him start from the back because obviously they had all of this free time to try and get his car back to working order, and fair play to the Red Bull mechanics for doing that. But yeah, that's another thing that I don't know if it's because he was so stressed with the whole situation. He seemed to just be like, yeah, that's fine. But obviously then Mercedes chirped up and were like, well, actually, that's not really allowed. And it ended up causing him more issues because he didn't just say, nope, you crashed, you had a recovery vehicle, bring you back, so therefore you can't start the race. He just didn't help himself there. So...
yeah, I mean, it's just, that entire weekend was just confusing and I don't think it was handled correctly. I think there's a lot that can be learned from there, and hopefully they have. But so then we get towards the end of the season, and again, the mounting pressure, the championship, you can't not take that out of the equation. There is a big narrative. Everyone's watching it. Lewis versus Max. It's getting closer and closer. And I kind of want to combine a few races together because obviously Sao Paulo, Qatar, and then Saudi Arabia. Now, Sao Paulo was the big one for me. Sao Paulo, and I'm talking obviously about turn 4 with Lewis and Max and that defending from Max where he went wide, and that wasn't even investigated. And that was the moment where I was like, I mean, when it comes to the Lewis Hamilton disqualification and the touching, his wing and stuff, that all of that, unlucky Lewis. That just happens. And with the whole Max getting a €50,000 fine, it was great for the memes, but that can happen.
Yeah.
But when we actually got to the race, for that to not even be investigated, regardless, even if Lewis was going to overtake him later, because obviously Lewis was absolutely mega around Sao Paulo, that has nothing to do with it. The fact that it wasn't even investigated, to me, that was now over the line. The fact that it was just almost let go as if nothing had happened. How did you feel about that at the time? Because that was where I kind of really thought, hang on a minute, something now seriously needs to change here.
Yeah, that was a definite red flag moment in the sense of like, that's alarming, not obviously a literal red flag. I forget you can't really say things like that in Formula One because it has another meaning. But yeah, that was really an odd one. I understand the let them race mentality. I think that's good and that's important and that's healthy for the sport in certain situations. But when you cross a line, that you can't just put let them race. Like things need to be.
There has to be a line. There has to be a line.
And things have to have consequences. Looking back at when Michael Schumacher was disqualified from the whole championship after his incident with, I think it was Villeneuve, you can't just be like, oh, it's Schumi, just let them race. Like he crossed a line and he deserved to be punished for that and be set an example of. But with this, it was kind of like they were just thinking, oh God, well, we don't want to do anything because we might get Christian Horner send us a really angry phone call or whatever. And it was a moment where I was like, that should have definitely been investigated. And the fact that then the onboards and stuff weren't available was another thing that I thought was really not great.
They didn't have an onboard of Max Verstappen.
How can you not have that? Like, that's surely in like the rules of just stewarding is like, okay, well, we need to make sure at all times we have a clear view of the onboard so we can see what the driver's doing with the steering wheel, how they looked side by side. I just don't understand how they're like, oh, we just don't have it. I was like, okay, well, that's not great. You need to get on the phone to Red Bull to be like, you need to give us, access, or whoever is in charge of giving them access to that camera. That's like of top importance. You need to have the onboards of the two championship contenders with 4 races to go or however many races it was. Like,
I think you need to have cameras from everyone. That should be just standardized. You need to have, doesn't matter if it's Schumacher and Mazepin fighting at the back or Lewis and Max fighting at the front. You need to have cameras, especially for the FIA. I mean, they need to have it. So that was a big one. But then, kind of off the back of that, there was a lot of controversy. The drivers were not happy. The drivers, no. there was a meeting between obviously the drivers in Qatar. That was another, and even Qatar, there was even a few things even there. I remember in qualifying with the reds and the lights,
and the flags,
even before the race, I think there was a bit of confusion between Fernando and one of the Ferraris in terms of who was starting where. I think there was something wrong. There's just these little things that keep popping up every single race now towards the end of the season. So there was something wrong in the document, so the teams didn't know where they started. So there's just little things that kept popping up. But it's the drivers thing that I really think back on in terms of all of them. Apparently, the 19 drivers, Max excluded, were not happy. And George Russell, who was like, I think, head of the GPDA, you have to obviously counter that he's going to be a Mercedes driver. You do have to take that into a kind of effect. But there was a lot of pushback from the drivers. And now if we're hearing the drivers complain about the fact that they don't even know what defending is, they don't know, why they're getting penalized earlier in the season and Max is not. Qatar was the big one where I think a lot of the drivers were voicing their opinions. And I think we didn't hear too much from them because I think they tried to really keep it kind of under wraps just between them and the FIA. You don't want too much of it to leak out. But I think a lot of drivers were kind of voicing their dissatisfaction that they don't even know what the rules of engagement actually are now.
Yeah, exactly. And even with the FIA, you've got to be so careful. Like Christian Horner is a perfect example after Qatar. He was saying that the FIA and the stewards, didn't have a clue what they were doing and the marshals and stuff. And he actually ended up getting called up to the steward's office to have a big smack on his wrist to say, you're not allowed to say this and, be disrespectful to the FIA in the media. And there are certain rules with that. So, yeah, the last thing you need as a driver to be, having a massive Katy rant of their own to the press because they're not going to be in the FIA's good books. But yeah, like you say, having so many drivers come out after that and allude that that had crossed the line. And I mean, one of the benefits, I know we mentioned earlier about having that influence from the drivers and from the team principals, and in certain situations I agree, like it's a really toxic situation to be in where you feel like you're just being told what to do by, you know, you're like a puppeteer essentially, or a puppet, and they're puppeteering you, if that's the right term. But I also think it is important to get the influence from the drivers. Yes, certain drivers might be a bit biased if they've got backing from Mercedes, or that, you know, they're a Honda powered driver and they're backing Verstappen, or whichever way it might be. But you know, with Masi, it's not a case of him being an F1 driver for 20 years. Although Charlie Whiting wasn't, you know, a professional driver in that sense, he'd had enough experience and enough knowledge from being within F1 and in working within teams and such. But yeah, I think it is important to get that input from the drivers to say, we actually all unanimously agree that crossed a line, and taking that going forward and applying that same rule. But it was a case of all the drivers saying we don't agree with it, and the FIA just going, okay, well, we're not going to listen to you. We're just going to carry on doing what we're going to do. And I think that's where things can get a little bit dangerous. In an ideal world, I know we might talk about this a bit going forward, but I think the role of the race director perhaps they need a bit more padding in terms of getting people there who working alongside the race director that is like an ex-F1 driver who can add some colour to what Michael Masi can see and what he can do and such. But yeah, that was a bit of an interesting one, hearing all these drivers be very critical after Sao Paulo.
Yeah, and then at this point, it's the pressure and kind of the pushback from the fans. It's race by race, because then we get to Saudi, another big. I mean, it is literally race by race. There seems to be just so much criticism towards the FIA, whether it's justified or not. Obviously, some people and tensions between the fans is really getting heated. So, you know, if you're a big supporter of Lewis and you want him to win, you're only going to see all the good stuff. If you're a big supporter of Max and you want to see him win, sometimes that can cloud your judgment. But even again in Saudi Arabia, there was more very tough racing between obviously Max and Lewis. And again, there was some defending, I think, that where Max went off the track, and then Michael Masi, and this is again a bit of inconsistency at that point, he did say for Max to hand over the position. And I kind of come back to what's the difference between that and Sao Paulo. I mean, I know it's different corners, but there's still some similarity. So there's just so much differences and inconsistencies between what they're saying. And then we get obviously their collision, you know, when they were trying to like play a few games. We know that they were definitely playing the DRS game, trying to let each other by. But allegedly, Michael Masi first told Red Bull and then told Mercedes, or something that confused the team. So
yeah, that was
again, just another race and another incident.
Yeah, that was a very odd order to do it in, especially if you've got one driver who has to perform an action such as letting someone by, it is probably better to let the person know who's going to be reacting to that reaction, to let them know from a safety point of view, okay, we're going to tell Max to give the position back, so be aware that he could decrease in speed, that, you know, he might suddenly move over to one side of the track to let Hamilton through, and it's to me that seems like just common sense, you know. But yeah, they told Red Bull first, and then Max being Max, obviously with so few laps left on the clock, and him knowing how much this position was going to be vital for the championship, he straight away, you know, slams on the brakes, and there's obviously a line of miscommunication between the FIA and Mercedes, and reporting that to Hamilton that, yeah, we had that incident. And my goodness, like my poor heart, like through the last few races of the 2021 season, like after I saw that, I was like, Max has won the championship. Oh my God. Because it was a case of like, if Hamilton DNF'd, Max had won. And that's I thought, I mean, if only we knew what was to come in Abu Dhabi, but I was like, if the championship ends like this is going to be disastrous. But fortunately, God knows how, you know, both cars were able to stay intact and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was really not a sensible way, in my opinion, of communicating what needed to change. because like I said, Max was obviously going to try and do that as soon as possible, and Hamilton was literally left in the dark almost. I know that there's the argument of, oh well, you could see him slowing down a little bit, and why did you get so close, and that kind of thing. And there was an element of the DRS chicken game to it. But still, I think part of that blame does need to lie with the FIA in terms of telling the correct people in the right order of what's about to occur.
I think even at that point, I understand how difficult it was in terms of, obviously, you've got this titanic title battle and you've got two drivers that are just going at it, two teams that clearly are only motivated by the success that they want to have, and you've got the race director trying to control them. But even though it is a high pressure situation, this is the time where you do need to control them. You need to get on top of it and stop them from playing the games, saying straight up to Max or Lewis or whoever it needs to be that this position needs to be handed back. It needs to be done like this. Enough of an advantage needs to be given. Because even, I mean, we're not going to talk about Saudi Arabia too much, but even then, I think Max re-overtook him, then got a penalty out of nowhere. I mean, yeah, then Lewis obviously kind of almost ran him wide as well. So there was just so much. I think at that point, the FIA really did kind of almost lose control a little bit of the race. I mean, but they need to be on top of it. And obviously, Abu Dhabi. So then we get into the title decider. And what's really interesting, looking back at it retrospectively, is that going into the weekend, the narrative was, is Max and Lewis going to collide? What's the championship going to be like if they do crash out? What happens if it's Max's fault? What happens if it's Lewis's fault? How is that going to happen? I do like that the FIA kind of clarified and did say that in the event of a crash in the title decider, points can be deducted. I do think that was kind of the right way to go, to at least remind the drivers that. Obviously, no one's saying that it's going to happen, but it's just funny that we expected it to be between Lewis and Max. We expected it to be a Red Bull and a Mercedes thing. And in the end, obviously, we're not going to talk about, we're not going to go through in terms of what actually happened because everyone already knows. But how did you feel about the last lap and a half, all of the team radios, everything that went on, then only 5 cars going past, and the way it eventually did end?
Yeah, well, the team principal radios, that was just so annoying. Like, when we were watching that last lap, and I think by this point either Verstappen was hunting down Hamilton or he'd passed him, and all you can hear is Toto being like, "No, Michael, no!" And it's like, just I get you're annoyed, but like, I just want to enjoy this last lap, because although yes, it's shrouded in controversy how it actually occurred, like, you can't take away from the fact that we got to see a championship decided on the last lap of the last race, and that was really cool. Obviously, if you're a Hamilton fan, you're probably not thinking that's that cool. But as somebody impartial who just enjoys F1 for what it is, you can't deny that was an entertaining and brilliant end to a finale. Like, you can't really ask much more than a championship being decided on the last lap. Like, it's peak Hollywood blockbuster, Michael Bay kind of action. But yeah, in terms of the actual way that the championship was ended, once again, the inconsistencies of like lap cars can't overtake. And then we hear all this team radio from Alonso and from Max being like, yeah, of course. Well, and you could tell in that moment, he just fully decided that was it, game over. He wasn't winning the championship. And I think that's one of the reasons why, emotions just went for I guess for Verstappen fans, went from accepting defeat to then within the space of 120 seconds being like, our guys just won the championship, what on earth? But yeah, the fact he said no lap cars can overtake, and then only choosing 5 of them to close the gap up to Hamilton and Verstappen. And obviously in that situation, Verstappen was he was 11 seconds behind 11 seconds behind Hamilton before Latifi had his incident and brought out the safety car. And with that gap was able to make a pit stop, so he was on fresher tyres, and that's just the way it is. If you're in second place, then you're able to make those calls and be in a better position if a situation like that does unfold. But yeah, it was certainly an interesting decision from Michael Masi, and with all these team principal clips being played and stuff, it did feel hugely influenced, whether that's just the way that it was manufactured with the way TV direction puts certain clips in. Obviously, we're never going to be able to get a full understanding of those. You know, F1 haven't published a full transcription of the team radios from the Mercedes camp, from the Red Bull camp, and how Michael Masi reacted to those. We only get a snippet of things being edited in on certain laps. But yeah, I know that Michael Masi and all the teams sort of agreed that they wanted the championship to be decided under green flag conditions, which you could argue is kind of consistent with, you know, the whole let them race mentality that we've seen with other penalties and the way things have been decided throughout the second half of the season. But yeah, there's no getting around the fact that it seemed very rushed. It was like, you can do this, no you can't. And then it was sort of over by in a flash. And I can see why some people have referred to it as a pantomime. And obviously, as an impartial F1 fan, you know, I've got drivers on the grid that I have, that I like more. A bit like you, I know you're a big Alonso fan and stuff like that, and you mentioned about Russell and stuff. There are people I like. I'm not necessarily a Team Hamilton or Team Verstappen. I like both drivers. I think they're both brilliant. But it's a disappointing end to what was a brilliant finale. I'm sure Max is going to be happy that he's won the championship and he's got that. His name's in the record books now. But perhaps in a few years' time he'll talk openly, because I'm sure it's going to be soured the way that it has ended. And same for Hamilton, you know, to have what would undoubtedly, if Nicholas Latifi had not crashed, Hamilton would have be an 8-time world champion now. And it's unfortunately Latifi did crash, but you know, incidents and accidents are part of Formula One. It's a dangerous sport. These things can happen. The timing obviously wasn't great if you're Lewis Hamilton, but yeah, it's just, I guess, kind of summed up perfectly how the FIA had operated all year within those last lap and a half. It kind of all came down to that. And it's sad, really, at the end of the day, that we're now a month on from that and we're still talking about it. And I mean, I feel like some days Twitter's never going to let that conversation die. And, you know, fair play. If you're seeking for what you think is justice, then good for you for using your platform and a voice, as long as you don't get nasty and rude and abusive. I don't think there's anything wrong with seeking answers to things. But there were so many wonderful moments last year, and yet here we are a month later still talking about Michael Masi and the FIA and the decisions that they made and nitpicking it. And I'm aware that I've given this answer like 10 minutes, but it's just one of those things that I feel like I need to be clear about. It's not something you can summarize to a friend. Like if you have a friend in passing and they're like, so what happened in Abu Dhabi? You can't be like, oh, well, let me just summarize it in 15 seconds for you. You're like, take a seat, make a drink, come back, and it's going to take like 15 minutes to try and explain what the hell just happened. But yeah, what about you? What do you think?
I think the thing that kind of frustrated me the most is that when it comes to Max being able to pit under the safety car, when it comes to Nicholas Latifi crashing, all of that is part of racing. I mean, Lewis was a beneficiary of that back in Imola when he had obviously his off, and the red flag he was able to get on brand new tires and come back to second. All of that is racing. Max being, you know, when it comes to Lewis not being able to overtake, not being able to pit, tough. You know, that's why that's all part of racing. And actually, I kind of did a bit of number crunching, and I forget the specific numbers, but if you kind of extrapolate how much time Lewis Hamilton spent behind Sergio Perez, I think by the end, if Lewis got past Perez way quicker, much sooner, and didn't mess about and did not struggle, I think by the end he would have had an 18 or 19 second gap. So then he could have actually pitted when Nicholas Latifi did crash. So in a way, it's a weird one, but by not getting past Sergio Perez quick enough, which, you know, again, that's partly down to him because he's the racing driver and Sergio Perez is the one on really bad tires. That's kind of down to Lewis and that's down to Mercedes. So again, all of those aspects, that's racing. But the thing that annoyed me is that Michael Masi chose, in a weird way, to put the show over sticking to the rules. And I totally get the precedent almost going into the race that under ideal circumstances, we want to finish under a green. I totally get that. I would say off the back of that, it's not a bad thing to finish under the safety car. The biggest example I always have is 2012. I mean, what a season. And that finale, I think people forget, finished under a safety car when Paul di Resta crashed. Does that taint that incredible kind of Brazilian Grand Prix where we saw, Fernando Alonso and Sebastian Vettel, one's the world champion, then it's the other, backwards and forwards? Of course it doesn't. It still is a great race. So I get why they wanted to finish under the green, but when it's that late on in the race, again, a race is only a certain amount of laps. And if the rules say that you can't do what he did, then in a weird way, he could have just finished the race under the safety car. But of course, that would have meant that I think that the drivers would have had to stay where they are, or he could have let the lap cars go. But then unfortunately, we wouldn't have had enough time for racing. But guess what? A race is a finite amount of laps. And he could have almost even if Red Bull were not happy, he could have just almost leaned back and said, that's what the rules are. I can't, I can't change them.
Christian, switch
that's
it
a
around.
motor race, exactly. But instead of the two options of either, letting the safety car go or bringing it in, but unfortunately, I think even if he brought the safety car in, the lapped cars still would have been there for one lap, and obviously it would have been very difficult for Max to get past 5 of them in one lap because they're all battling for position. Let's not forget those 5 lap cars. I think they were battling for points as well. So yeah, that also would have meant that Lewis perhaps would have just had enough to finish that lap. But instead he chose a contrived middle option, which we then kind of found out he can do because, he has the power, he's the race director. But the one kind of phrase I've used is out of all of the races to pull something out your backside that, it's a very controversial decision that isn't technically even supposed to be done because it doesn't stick to the actual rules. He chose the final lap of the final race of the biggest season we've had in arguably decades. That's the moment he chooses to pull something out of his backside when really it wasn't even technically an option. So, and you've got to also remember how many people were watching that race for the very first time. Yeah. I know for a fact I've got 2 or 3 friends that literally watched their first race in Abu Dhabi because they heard Lewis versus Max equal on points. It was also shown, Channel 4 got the rights to show it on free air TV. So there were so many people that were watching that for the first time. And the fact that it wasn't anything to do with Max, it wasn't anything to do with Lewis. In the end, Michael Masi choosing to put the show over everything else, over sticking to the rule book, it influenced the championship, and that's what kind of really soured my taste. It's not that Max won or that Lewis would have won. Both of them are undoubtedly worthy champions. And again, even in a strange way, Max, in my opinion, was the better driver. I did a list of my top 5 drivers of 2021, and I had Max as my number 1 because I think that overall he was the more consistent driver just a little bit. Not as many mistakes, but both of them deserved to win it. But the way in which it happened, it's just, that left a very sour taste in my mouth. And a good friend of mine, Ben Hocking, who's part of the Late Breaking F1 podcast, I remember listening to something that he said, and I think it was on the lines of the FIA are supposed to be about, number 1, safety, fairness, and then I think he said something, safety and fairness are the 2 things that are supposed to be at the very forefront of the FIA. And the one thing I'd go back to when we talk about fairness, when we talk about inconsistencies, why just those 5 lapped cars? Why, if the rules really are the same for both Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, and then anyone at the back of the field as well, why did Carlos Sainz not get a chance to fight for second place or maybe even his first ever win? Why was it only the 5 lapped cars between Lewis and Max? Surely Sainz should have had just as much of an opportunity to fight for his first ever Grand Prix win. And so it's just all of these things that kind of arose off the back of what I think was a decision that didn't even need to be made. I mean, even if Red Bull and Mercedes were going to be frustrated that the race was not going to be finished under green, and that it was going to be finished under the safety car, again, Masi would have had that kind of safety net of, I follow the rules. What do you want me to do? Twist the rules for, just because you didn't win? So it's just that he took a really strange route. And in the end, it wasn't decided by Red Bull or Mercedes. It was decided by the FIA. And that's what still, I think, it doesn't taint Verstappen's championship to me, but it taints the season and the decider just a little bit.
Yeah, one thing that has stuck with me from Abu Dhabi is my granny, who, she watches some Formula One, obviously she doesn't pay for Sky, so she might occasionally see highlights, and she tries to keep her ear to the ground to see what's going on because of my job, and most of my family are into F1. But she said to me, she was like, oh, this Michael Masi guy, he's really ruined, he's screwed up here, hasn't he? And I was thinking, oh my God, like, you're talking about Michael Masi and you have such a limited knowledge of F1, yet you know that this one individual is responsible for something extremely controversial. And to me, I was like, wow, that's a big deal. And I'm sure, like you say, you've got friends that were tuning into that, but I was getting people I hadn't spoken to in months or even years messaging me like, wow, I've just seen what happened in Abu Dhabi. Like, what did you think of it and stuff? And although you could argue it's good for F1 because people were talking about it, it wasn't like, wow, that season finale in Abu Dhabi was so fair and like all this kind of stuff. It was controversial, and that's why people were talking about it. And if F1 want to put themselves to that, then you do you, I guess. But for most of us that have been watching for years, or even new fans to the sport, the last thing you want is for your treasured hobby or passion to have people who don't really follow it talking about it in such a tainted way. It's not pleasant, because you're like, I promise it's more than just like the controversial last lap in Abu Dhabi. Like, we had so much more this season that you could talk about and enjoy, but everyone just wants to talk about Abu Dhabi.
Yeah. In terms of all of the obviously official stuff afterwards, even as we kind of record this, there's obviously the FIA report that they're doing into Abu Dhabi. Mercedes obviously dropped their appeal after, I think it was a few weeks actually, or maybe like a week later, because obviously they were not happy. There's still a lot that, even now, there's still a lot that is going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. Mercedes want action. Does that mean Michael Masi and his job and someone else's as well? There's still, even like you said, over a month later, there are still questions that we don't even have the answers to. But I suppose rounding off kind of this video and really focusing now on probably what's more important than anything else is going forward. Changes need to be made, and we need to have almost, for 2022 onwards, something that I've thought is a brand new precedent. It's a brand new generation of Formula One now. Forget what happened with Senna, Prost, Schumacher, Hill, or anything, Max, Lewis, all of that precedent I think just needs to go away, and we have a brand new generation, a clean slate. And I honestly feel like the FIA really do need to sit down with the drivers and the teams. Those are the two most important ones, the drivers and the teams, because the fans will learn as we watch. But I think even if it's examples of overtakes that, have happened in the past and in 2021, show it to the drivers and set a brand new precedent. This is now what's going to be allowed. Forget what happened in the years before. This is now the precedent. This is what we want. I think that's what needs to happen right now. And does that include Michael Masi? I mean, what do you think in terms of his job? Because obviously loads of people on the internet want to see him gone, and they think that he's the kind of the only problem. But to me, I haven't fully been on the get rid of Michael Masi train, because it's not just him. And ultimately, even though it is a high pressure job, and it is a very, very high pressure job, I certainly wouldn't want it, that's for sure. But ultimately, as the race director, you have to deliver. Just like the drivers, you have to deliver under pressure. You have to know what you're doing, and it has to be fair across the entire season, across the entire field, from driver to driver, from team to team. And the one thing that, why I'm not 100% on the Michael Masi out train is, if he's struggling, help him, get more people in there. Is that what they need? More people that know the rule book, more people that can support him? Because clearly, definitely the team principal radio has to go. Because the one thing that I thought about Abu Dhabi is that it was really fun in 2021 when we first got to hear it. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Like, even in Silverstone, there was so much banter about it. But in Abu Dhabi, to me, it almost crossed the line where it was almost like both Toto Wolff and Christian Horner were trying to almost race fix a little bit. Like, I remember when Giovinazzi, I think, crashed out or retired. I think it was Toto Wolff that said, "This is not a safety car. This is not a safety car, Michael."
Yeah.
And at that point, I was like, that now crosses the line. You don't tell the race director what, that you want a safety car or not. So that's certainly something that I think needs to be changed. But what's your thoughts about everything that you want to see going forward? How do we fix the inconsistencies that we've talked about over the past, 3-4 years?
Well, I think Masi, I believe, should depart his position as race director. It's a difficult one, because the reality is there's not many people that I think would be suitable to fill that position. The FIA kind of got themselves into a bit of trouble when His name was Laurent Mekies, I think is how you pronounce the surname, or Mekies, I'm not sure. But he was the deputy race director, and I went to a lecture that he did a few years ago at the Autosport International show. There's like a Watkins lecture in which different people from the FIA or, in safety departments had these open conversations and, try and educate. And Laurent was presenting this discussion about the Halo, which had just been announced as being introduced in F1. And I remember sitting there thinking, wow, this guy, he's so intelligent, and, the way he's coming across is brilliant. And yeah, at the time he was a deputy race director, and I was like, oh, I feel, comfortable knowing this guy could be the future of the FIA and race director. And then he left and went to Ferrari. So he's there at the moment. And, fair play taking on a role like that, going to Ferrari. I don't say that it's a bad thing. He's allowed to do what he wants. But yeah, it kind of left a bit of a gap. And then obviously Masi was as part of that deputy race director thing as well. But I think from the amount of criticism and controversies that have all come back to Masi this year especially, I think the FIA needs a clean slate for 2022. But like I said, who will be that person that replaces him is a really difficult question to answer, because obviously in a great person who I think would fit in well would be somebody like Ross Brawn. He's got a great deal of experience. He's worked with Ferrari, he's worked with Brawn, he's been been in that team principal role, and he knows the technical side of things as well, and he's got F1's best interests at heart. But I don't think it would be possible for him to leave his role at the moment within F1 and jump into a race director, tomorrow, for example.
Yeah.
There are other race directors in other championships. Scott Elkins is the Formula E race director, also does Extreme E, and he also goes to the F1 races and shadows Michael Masi sometimes. But, removing him from Formula E and, to be honest about Formula... Yeah, and, Formula E is about to start its new season in Saudi in a couple of weeks' time. It would be quite an irresponsible move to remove him from that position right before they start a season. And, same thing, there's been some questionable decisions that Scott Elkins has made within Formula E. Even last season, there was a moment where there was a green flag given and there was still a recovery truck on the circuit. So, he's not got exactly like a clean track record. So the FIA have kind of got themselves a bit stuck as to who they could get to replace Masi. Perhaps maybe they say, we've put him on some leadership courses or something, I don't know, and he's had a stern talking to with the new FIA president, and we're going to treat this season, because he's got that experience, we're going to treat this as a new start for him, and we're going to help transform the rule book, bring it up to the 21st century, because another thing about the rule book, which, in the grand scheme of things is pretty small, it's pretty pedantic, but everyone is referred to as a he, which is another thing that I'm like, it wouldn't be that hard to just change it to a they, and I know that people are going to be like, oh my God, she's such a snowflake just because everyone's referred to as a he, but even
that's
team
F1
principals.
Twitter, that voice right there.
Yeah.
That's all I can hear.
But it's if we're already going to be rewriting a big chunk of the rule book, that I think that's something that would be quite a good thing to change. Obviously, it's not going to affect the rules of racing by changing he to they or whatever, but there are lots of things about the rule book that need to have a big overhaul for 2022. And like you say, I do hope that they sit down with the teams, with the drivers, hear what they have to say, what is right, what is wrong, maybe draft in ex-F1 drivers, some ex-world champions, or, people that maybe don't have specific links to teams. People like that I think would be a crucial part to get them involved. But the FIA needs to do something, and they need to show the public that they're doing something, because at the moment Twitter is there with their pitchforks, aren't they? They're ready to tackle the FIA after what happened in Abu Dhabi.
Everyone on Twitter is ready to take over Michael Masi's job. They're all good enough to be race directors, apparently.
Apparently so. I mean, imagine F1 Twitter being in charge for a race. That would be a scary thought. But, you know, they need to also show us, you know, armchair experts what they are doing, because otherwise it kind of feels like they're just treating everyone a bit like a mug, and they just think, oh, well, they'll forget about it in no time. And I really hope that Ben Suleiman, who is this new FIA president, he can see, you know, I'm sure he's aware of the reaction that F1 fans have had to Abu Dhabi, but, you know, this is his chance as the new FIA president to say, look, we take everyone's opinions seriously, and these are the changes that we're making, and we want to be upfront and honest with you. Obviously, they're not going to turn around and be like, we messed up, guys, we made a big mistake. But he can sort of say, now I'm in charge, this is what's going to change. And yeah, I think F1 needs something, because I'm slightly worried about when we get to Bahrain for that first race of this season, because there's just going to be a big cloud hanging over the F1 paddock and F1 in general if the FIA don't, you know, share an update or tell us what's changing.
I think, from what we saw from the drivers, some of the drivers' reactions, you can hear on the team radio in after Abu Dhabi. Doesn't matter if you're a Mercedes or a Red Bull fan. Obviously, the big kind of emotion is from both of their fans, because they're the ones fighting for the title. But it doesn't matter who you support. There is no way that you can look at the last 2-3 years and say, nothing needs to be changed. Everything was totally fine on both sides. So for 2022, I think the one thing I do agree with Toto Wolff is that we need to see action, not just words. Now, is the FIA going to admit that something wasn't quite right, that procedures weren't followed? They were quite lucky that Mercedes did drop their protest, because Mercedes had a case ultimately. Like that could have really gotten very political and very nasty. But now the FIA, they've been given that kind of breathing space to just do their investigation, and they need to. It'll be interesting to see how much culpability they actually admit, because ultimately it's the FIA investigating the FIA, and that isn't always kind of the right thing. But the one thing for sure is that we as fans, and the drivers especially, I think the drivers more than anything else, they need to know what is allowed, what isn't allowed. And I think, again, on the Michael Masi front, that's my problem. Like, drop him all you want, but he's not just the only one that's the problem. And who do you replace? So is it getting him more support, getting more people in? Yeah, I mean, we're going to see, but I think the thing we really want to see is just change for 2022 and meaningful action.
Exactly. Like you say, new regulations this year. And it could be, the start of an incredible journey for Formula One on track. So let's also try and make sure that the same kind of rules are applied off track in terms of the FIA and the stewarding, and making sure to maintain the brilliant safety standards that the FIA have brought. Because that's the other thing, is like, you can sit and critique the FIA and the stewarding all you like, but the FIA is responsible for so much more than just telling people you've broken this rule and you get a penalty or whatever. It's the technical side of things and the safety aspects of things. Like, the FIA they've saved countless lives, even with the introduction of the halo as one part of it. Like, that's such a small addition to the car in the grand scheme of how the FIA have managed a championship for decades and decades. But the FIA, and it's not just F1 that it's responsible for. Obviously, it looks after rallying, it looks after Formula E, it looks after so many other championships, that by not resolving and giving a sensible solution to the F1 problem, they're actually tarnishing their other championships and their other relations that they've got there. So I really just hope that everything gets sorted, because I don't want to be sat here, no offense to you, but like in another year's time, still going on about Michael Masi and all the inconsistencies he might have made in the 2022 season. Us F1 fans, we're very simple beings. We just want to see good racing, fair racing, and that's pretty much it. That's all we really want.
Well, if that doesn't happen, then me and Katy will see you in January of 2023. So stay tuned. Literally. But anyway, Thank you so much for coming on, Katy, and having a proper, I don't even know how long we've been recording, but it's been definitely fun to have a proper rant about the FIA.
It was like a therapy session, mate.
there was a lot that we needed to get off. But again, thank you
I
so
feel
much
much
for coming
lighter.
on. Exactly, yeah. Anyway, thank you again.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Well, there you have it. Once again, a big thank you to Katy for joining me on this video. It's definitely a topic that both of us are very passionate about, and it's also good from time to time on this channel to do these longer, more in-depth kind of videos that I do love to do with other people as well. As always, let me know all of your thoughts in the comments box below about everything that we discussed, and if you did enjoy this video, then don't forget to drop it a like, and also smash that subscribe button to support the channel. That would be greatly appreciated, and I will see you in the next one.